Okay, Act 4, Scene 3. This is quite a long scene, a little bit of a confusing scene at points. I'm not gonna. You should have read it already, but I'm gonna just kind of pick out some key things and talk about what is going on. So it opens with Malcolm and Macduff in England before the King's Palace. So that's King Edward of England, who we've already heard a little bit about. And Malcolm went there to kind of seek some help, and Macduff has gone to follow. And Malcolm is generally pretty sad about the whole situation. I mean, his dad is dead. He's talking about grief at the beginning. Let us seek out some desolate shade, and there weep our sad bosoms empty. And Macduff is instead saying, let us rather hold fast the mortal sword. So he's saying, like, come on, this is no time for grief. We need to go and stop Macbeth. All right? And then we get an interesting um, conversation between the two of them, where Macduff talks about, and if you go through, talks about how this is terrible for Scotland and that Macbeth is the most horrible king, and they want Malcolm back. But Malcolm is not so keen. So Malcolm says some slightly suspicious things. First of all, he says, um, when talking to Macduff, he says, "You have loved him well. He hath not touched you yet," as in he hath not harmed you yet, or anything to do with you. Now, there's a dramatic irony going on here because we know, even though Macduff doesn't know yet, or Malcolm, we know that Macduff's family has just been killed, so he has actually been touched. But we see here that Malcolm is understandably suspicious of Macduff, just as he's suspicious of everyone. Everyone's suspicious of everyone at this point in the play. And so even though he's not outwardly saying it, he's not entirely sure about this Macduff guy showing up to support him. And Macduff's pretty outright. He's like, I am not treacherous. And Malcolm then talks about how Macbeth is treacherous and has done bad things for the country, but, and this is a little bit odd, Malcolm then talks about how he would be an even worse king. So there's just in talking about the terrible things that are happening to the country, I just want you to note the imagery of the country bleeding. So Macduff says, bleed, bleed, poor country. And further down, Malcolm says, it weeps, it bleeds, and each day a new gash is added to her wounds. So this idea of Scotland being sucked out of the life out of her, the blood being sucked out of her, is an important image that everyone sees taking place. But then Malcolm turns around and says, "It is myself I mean, in whom I know all the particulars of vice, so bad things, so grafted that when they shall be opened, Black Macbeth will seem as pure as snow." So basically, I would be such an awful king that if I took over, then Black Macbeth would seem as pure as snow by comparison. He says here, being compared with my confineless harms. Now, Macduff doesn't understand. Macduff's like, not in the legions of horrid hell can come a devil more damned in evils to top Macbeth. So we really get Macduff's position on Macbeth pretty strongly here. And Malcolm agrees. He says, I grant him bloody, luxurious, avaricious, false, deceitful, sudden, malicious, smacking of every sin that has a name. And this repetitive use of asyndeton, where the just adjectives with commas in between them, really serves to show how everyone feels about Macbeth at this point in time. Like, everybody hates him. But Malcolm still says, better Macbeth than such a one to reign. He's talking about himself here. And Macduff still doesn't understand. And it's not till later on that we start to get a sense of what is going on. Basically, Malcolm's testing Macduff. Malcolm is worried that either Macduff is working for Macbeth, or Macduff is coming to use him to take the throne for himself, or whatever it is that it might be. Okay? And so he keeps saying, no, but Macbeth is the most, basically this is, Macbeth is the most horrible king in the world. And Malcolm saying, yeah, but I'd be terrible as well, so I don't want to be king. Macduff, most horrible king in the world. Yeah, but I'd be terrible as well. And Macduff is ending up saying, oh, Scotland, like he's really mourning for Scotland here because he thinks it's awful. And then Malcolm gives him a suggestion. Malcolm says, if such a one be fit to govern, speak. I am as I have spoken. So Malcolm's testing Macduff here. Malcolm is suggesting, like, well, if you can think of a better person that might rule Scotland, maybe you should say so. Expecting, or perhaps worrying, that Macduff might turn around and say, I should be the one to rule Scotland. But this is not what happens. Macduff says, fit to govern? No, not to live. Oh, nation miserable, with an untitled tyrant bloody sceptred. When shalt thou see thy wholesome days again? So he's mourning for Scotland here. That's his response to this. And it really goes to show that Macduff is not out for himself. Macduff is worried about Scotland as a country. And that's the thing that really concerns him and worries him. And we see that a little bit earlier. Where's the line that I'm looking for? As well, we see Macduff say, even while Malcolm's saying, I'd be a terrible king, Macduff saying, but fear not yet to take upon you what is yours. So Macduff sees that Scotland is Malcolm's, it belongs to him because he descended from Duncan, right? So it's pretty clear throughout this whole section where Malcolm's kind of goading him into it that Macduff is not interested in being ruler of Scotland. Macduff just wants to put things right. Macduff just wants to save Scotland from Macbeth. And this whole thing is Malcolm trying to test whether or not Macduff has any kind of ambition himself, whether or not he's a bit of a Macbeth himself, right? Because Malcolm's already been burnt before. And it comes out really clearly that he is not. All he cares about is Scotland. And this sets him up in direct juxtaposition with Macbeth, who at this point, as we've seen, is all he cares about is himself. He cares nothing for Scotland anymore. He's all about himself. Whereas Macduff doesn't seem to care about his own ambitions. He just wants Scotland to be okay. And so we've got this kind of direct opposition of two characters, of kind of good and evil, loyal to Scotland, loyal to himself, Macduff, Macbeth, right? And that kind of sets up the final act to some degree. Once Macduff Macduff basically says that if you don't want to be king to Malcolm, he says, fare thee well, these evils thou repeatst on thyself have banished me from Scotland. O my breast, thy hope ends here. So he's showing that he doesn't want any of this leadership. Malcolm replies, Macduff, this noble passion, child of integrity, hath from my soul wiped the black scruples, reconciled my thoughts to thy good truth and honour. So, wonderful, I believe in you, I trust you, you're great. Let me tell you what the plan is. And the plan, as we find out later, is that old Siward, who is an English warrior and general with 10,000 warlike men already at a point, was setting forth. So King Edward has given a general and 10,000 men to support taking back Scotland from Macbeth. And they're planning on doing this together. Now, Macduff's a little bit confused because he's just had this whole, like, oh, I'd be a terrible king, blah, blah, blah. And now Malcolm's just completely switched. And he says, such welcome and unwelcome things at once. Which reminds us of that kind of fair is foul and foul is fair, those kind of contradictory statements. We see how much in this play is kind of two-faced and contradictory all of the time. And Shakespeare reminds us of that with those oppositions in the statements. Anyway, there's this weird little moment where a doctor shows up and talks about some people being ill, and they talk about how the good king is the King Edward of England is able to, through basically just being a wonderful divine king, is able to heal people just by touching them. He says, how he solicits heaven himself best knows. But strangely visited people, all swollen, ulcerous, pitiful eye, the mere despair of surgery, he cures. Um, and once again, we're just setting up other lines of royalty to prove how terrible Macbeth is, right? In England, the king is noble and royal, and what happens when you're the rightful king? You can cure people just by touching them. Macbeth, what happens when he's the wrongful king? The whole of Scotland is going to pot, basically. And so that's kind of just used as a continuation. Now, Ross shows up to tell Macduff that his whole family is dead. And there's this really sad, powerful moment as it builds up to us. Ross almost can't say it and struggles to tell him. And Macduff finds out eventually, and he's just completely broken. Merciful heaven, what man? Never pull your hand upon your brows, give sorrow words, the grief that does not speak whispers the overfraught heart and bids it break. And sorry, that's Malcolm saying that. All Macduff's really able to say is, my children too? So we've had Ross say, your castle is surprised, your wife and babe savagely slaughtered. Great, to the point. And Macduff can just say, my children too? And Ross says, wife, children, servants, all that they could be found. Macduff, and I must be from thence. My wife killed too? It's almost like he's not processing this information, right? He's having to repeat it over and over again. And Ross is like, I have said. He has no children. All my pretty ones? Did you say all? Like he can't process the fact that all of his family have just been killed, right? He's just completely in shock and overwhelmed with that grief, and we can see that through that repetition of those questions. And this whole bit here is just all the questions are forming kind of caesura in the lines. They're all over the place. His brain is completely taken aback. And now we have kind of an inversion of what happened at the beginning of the scene, where Macduff is so sad and grieving and says, like, heaven rest them now. And Malcolm says, be this the whetstone of your sword. Let grief convert to anger, blunt not the heart, enrage it. So now it's Malcolm's turn to Macduff and say, turn this into fighting words, right? Let's go find Macbeth, the man who killed your whole family, and let's go deal with him. And he commits to, he says, but gentle heavens cut short all intermission. Front to front, bring thou this fiend of Scotland, and myself within my sword's length set him. And so we're setting up for the last act, right? We've Shakespeare's set up the opposition of Macbeth and Macduff through a number of different means in this act. This act is all about building up to Act 5. So we've had the supernatural means in Act 4, Scene 1, where the witches say, beware Macduff! We have the emotional means, where Macduff's whole family is killed and he's got more motive than anyone to be hating Macbeth. And we've got the kind of ideological differences, where we've got Macbeth as this kind of completely out for himself corrupt king, and we've got Macduff as this completely noble, loyal person who wouldn't even consider taking the kingship if it was offered to him. He just wants the best for Scotland. So for all these reasons, there's a clear kind of opposition set up that's bound to be resolved in Act 5 when Macduff faces Macbeth and when the army arrives at Macbeth's castle. So we're left with quite a lot of dramatic tension built up at the end of Act 4, diving into Act 5, which is going to be just a big battle, and we're going to see how everything resolves.